Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another batch of CPDP, although a bit differently this time of the year due to the circumstance. My name is Samson Isaias. I'm an associate professor at BI Norwegian Business School, and I will be moderating this panel on global AI governance perspectives from 4 continents. So the panel is organized by the BI, by the Nordic Center for Internet and Society at BI Norwegian Business School as part of a project titled Triple Partnership for Responsible AI. And this project is funded by the Research Council and brings research institutions from Norway, Brazil, and the US, basically trying to share experiences and knowledge on the societal impacts of AI across geographies. So our partner institutions are the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard and the Institute for Technology and Society at Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And we have panelists representing both of our partners. So there is a lot of discussion on the societal, political, and economic impacts of artificial intelligence. And one sobering fact from those discussions is that the harms and the benefits of AI are not distributed equally across geographies and populations. So when we thought about this panel, the question we had was, is it if benefits and harms are not distributed equally across geographies, is it practical to talk about global AI governance? And do we have shared concerns that we can use as a basis for global AI governance, let alone how to address them? And assuming that there are shared concerns, how do we go about achieving or developing global norms and standards that are accepted across jurisdictions and continents? So those are some of the questions that we thought about, and we have now today invited stellar panelists to this session to help us answer those questions. So our hope is that by the end of this session, we will hear perspectives from different regions, from the US, Latin America, and Asian Pacific perspectives. And we also hope to have an EU perspective, but our speaker from EU, Professor Sofia Rankoras from the University of Groningen, just informed me an hour ago that she fell ill and will not be able to attend the session, so we have to scale it a bit to 3 continents, at least for now. But luckily, we have Dr. Angela Daly, who is also a bit familiar with the EU discussion. So at least at the end of the session, we can ask questions to help us to elaborate at least the EU perspective in light of the Asian Pacific initiatives that she will talk about. So without further ado, I would just briefly introduce our panelists for today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Angela Daly, who is an associate professor at the University of Strathclyde, and she is a co-director of also the Center for Internet Law and Policy. Angela's research focuses on the regulation of new technologies, and she has published books addressing private power and information flows, and as well as the social legal aspects of 3D printing technologies. She is also a co-author of an important report for this panel, which is a report on artificial intelligence governance and ethics from global perspectives. And Angela is currently located in Scotland, but she is a well-traveled scholar with many years of experience in Australia as well as Hong Kong. And also, Angela will share her perspective on AI governance initiatives from the perspective of Asia-Pacific regions. Angela, the floor is yours. We're not able to hear you, Angela. No, no worries. We're not able to hear you again. Yeah. Okay, I will then introduce the other panelists until she gets her. So our second speaker will be Selina Betriz, who is director for the Institute of Technology and Society in Rio de Janeiro, and she's an expert in human rights and technology. Selina has a master's degree from Harvard University in human rights, and she has worked also as a researcher for the Human Rights Watch and as a consultant for the Harvard Human Rights Clinic. She's also an affiliate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and we're very lucky to have you, Selina, here with us. She will share her perspectives on AI governance initiatives in Latin America and Brazil. Our third speaker would be Adam Nagy, who is a project coordinator for the cyber clinic at Harvard Law School and the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Adam researches on the use of algorithms in the criminal justice system and has also worked on disinformation and harmful speech online. For the purpose of our panel, Adam is a co-author also of an important paper on entitled Principled AI, where they kind of conduct a meta-analysis of different AI policy documents and came up with 8 or 9 thematic AI principles. And as part of this project also, they have created this wonderful visual showing the different topics, AI principles, and the core thematics of across all the several documents that they have studied. Adam will show us that visualization in his talk, and he will also share his perspectives on global AI governance and a bit on the US perspective. So do we have Angela's mic fixed now?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Finally, thank you. So sorry about that, but it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Samson, and thanks to other panelists and also the audience for being patient. I'm very happy to be speaking about developments in AI governance in the Asia-Pacific region. My own area of expertise or country of expertise really is Australia in that region, but as Samson said, I do have a bit of knowledge and expertise about China and some other countries as well. Overall, what I would say is that the Asia Pacific is the region outside of Europe which has been most active in terms of AI governance initiatives and discussions. There's a very rich discussion going on in different countries in the Asia Pacific about governing AI. And perhaps it's not a big surprise, particularly when we see so much AI coming out of China in particular, and great enthusiasm for the development and use of AI in other Asia Pacific countries, like Singapore, for instance, where the government has been supporting to a very large degree the development of AI and an AI industry. Australia as well is another example where there's a lot of government support and also an industry working on AI solutions. So firstly, I think the important point is that, in my view anyway, outside of Europe, Asia Pacific is really a region that you have to look at and engage with to understand global AI discussions. One thing which is quite different from Europe, or at least the European Union, is that I don't see a very unified approach to AI governance in the Asia Pacific region. Mostly it's different countries, adopting their own approaches. So China has been very active in that regard. There's been a very rich and long and deep discussion about AI ethics and AI governance in China, at the same time that there's been this huge development of AI there. There have been some efforts to try and translate some of that discussion outside of China, particularly into the English language. But I think, as well as the EU, China is probably the global power, which has done the most around AI ethics, at least in this conceptual stage. And if you do look at the AI ethics principles that have been put forward in China, there's a lot of kind of commonality, at least at the abstract level, with, in fact, AI principles coming out of Europe and other parts of the world. But of course, the devil is in some of the detail. There are also some principles that do kind of reflect, I guess, Chinese cultural and social political notions as well. But the devil being in the detail is that kind of these very broad and abstract principles, how, if they are indeed applied in practice, I think is something which will be and is quite different in China to other parts of the world, and in particular Europe. And of course, lots of controversies in China about very problematic uses of AI, particularly in Xinjiang against Uyghur and other minority groups there as well. So the whole discussion and concern about ethics washing is something very active, I would say, in the well, it's very applicable to the Chinese context as well. Moving to some other countries in the region, India also being a very big power, actually has relatively limited discussion on AI. It doesn't really have a set of ethics principles. We do see some activity in the, I guess, richer Asia Pacific countries, Singapore, Australia, setting out their own governance frameworks and ethics principles. But like I said before, not really a kind of unified approach, unlike at least in the European Union. At the global level, there are quite a few Asia Pacific countries that have been participating in the GPI initiative, including India, including Singapore, Australia, and notably not including China. So I think there is a kind of coalescing around GPI as something of a global approach to AI governance, but the fact it excludes China, and I think Russia as well, does limit how global that initiative actually is. Not sure how much time I've got left, but before I finish, or just to finish, there have been some really interesting aspects of the AI governance and ethics discussions in the Asia Pacific. Really looking.
7 minutes, Angela, that's fine.
Okay, well, I'll just finish this and then I'm probably done for now, but very interested to have questions. But I just want to mention really the incorporation of Indigenous and non-Western cultural perspectives in AI governance. That is something which is being done probably the most in New Zealand at the moment. So New Zealand's algorithmic charter is looking at Maori legal and cultural concepts in its application. And that also represents quite a big difference to approaches in the Western world and particularly Europe. So that's another aspect to watch out for in Asia Pacific decisions.
Thank you, Angela, for your interesting input. I think we'll move on. I think there will be definitely some questions there, and maybe dig a bit later in the Q&A session. But now we will move to our second speaker, Selina Betriz from the Institute for Technology and Society at Rio. Selina, the floor is yours. We can't hear you, Selina.
Sorry. Now can you hear?
Yes. And
okay.
You need the slides to be shared. Martin, can you share the slides?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the invite, and we just yeah, now it's better, right?
Yes, it's better now.
Well, so thank you for the invite to be part of this panel. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good night for everyone, since I think we're all in different time zones. As Samson mentioned, I'm Selina. I'm project director at ITS Rio, which is a think tank from here at Rio de Janeiro. And we are we are focusing on, as a whole, how the impact of technology in society. So now AI is a big chunk of what we are working on right now. And the idea here of this talk would be to try and put a bit in perspective all of these discussions that we see, especially in the global north, regarding the development of AI. So before I start talking a bit more about the governance and regulatory initiatives here, especially here in Brazil, I'd just like to give an overview of and contrasting some of the focusing some sectors of development of AI and how far behind we would be here in Brazil in some areas. So just as a starting point, getting this 100-year study from on artificial intelligence from Stanford University, where it focuses its studies in areas regarding cities in the United States, but in some areas of life, of society, and how they predict that it will be in some fewer in years ahead. So, first of all, regarding, for example, transportation, if we could just so self-driving cars would be, the expectation is a bit far now. It's not already 10 million for self-driving cars, but still the expectation will be that it will be a commonplace to have self-driving cars around. But again, if you're trying to put it in perspective here regarding our reality, for example, in Brazil, this is a picture that shows how areas are not of important areas are still not mapped. So if you see, if we're getting from the perspective that self-driving cars will need to be guided by the maps and applications that will guide them. Here shows how specifically in important area in Rio, is this Copacabana beach, how vulnerable areas are still on maps. So they do not appear in Google Maps. So you see how still these areas would be excluded from the uses and practical uses of some like AI applications. So we still have a bit, we're still behind on preparing the like the main or the simplest techniques and infrastructure that will be needed to implement these other advanced technological advances. So the other area would be next one. For example, home. So you see, like automated vacuum cleaners were the first, probably the first like robots that began to be commonplace in most households, especially in the U.S. and other developed countries, as well as all these automated butlers. But if you see, put it into perspective, for example, many Brazilian houses still lack electricity, for example. So it's still a big gap for you to start to trying to bring these discussions. They don't necessarily fit very well depending on how you frame it, because we're still years behind. Another area, for example, would be in healthcare, where we see that AI applications have a lot of they can help develop, for example, in diagnosis and try and solve lots of problems and really present better services and for people. But again, and now in Brazil, our public health system, which is a universal health system, which is really nicely drafted on paper, but still is all the data that you would need to inform all these AI appliances and applications that could be used to help health problems and to help deliver a better service for people. They wouldn't be possible because all these data are not they are not in the digital format, and they are not machine readable. So again, we lack the basic inputs for the development of these AI practical appliances. And another, in education, the same situation, where we see the United States started to introduce kind of robots and AI applications in schools from like the 1980s. And each year we see other developments. But again, these specific applications would need a simple infrastructure such as internet connections. And the sad reality is that the huge majority of public schools in Brazil are not connected to internet. They really don't have access to internet, and the ones that have, they have really low quality internet, so cannot use all these technical and ed tech initiatives to better their so the last area here that I would like to mention, for example, regarding low resource communities, that's what we see. For example, here is an example in the US how AI is used to distribute food to food banks. But again, here we think we have to really bear in mind how we can make how to be really mindful that all these development of AI tools are really distributed as possible it is, not to make this social divide even larger. And I think last part would be regarding public security, which is also an area which you will see lots of surveillance cameras and all these security command centers being put into place, which again inspired a bit of concern, especially because Brazil did not have until end of last year a data protection bill in place, which is now recent legislation. But all these kind of uses of cameras and AI applications inspires a bit of like concern of how it will be used, not to be used in discriminatory way, and how we can prevent the negative effect of eventual biases that we know that may happen. So this was just a very quick overview of to try and put these situations a bit in perspective when we start to discuss about AI governance. Once we have our reality a bit not like in connection of all these policy and high-level discussions. And regarding Latin America, so the region suffered when textile industry moved to Asia in the 90s, and it's still a concern in the region if all these AI developments would make, again, will result in losses of jobs. So you can see that this is a concern once there is our former Ministry of Science. He presented a bill prohibiting automation in the public sector. So this bill is not moving forward yet, but you can see it shows how like the concerns to try and prevent the loss of jobs, especially in the public sector, which can prevent prevent the public sector from getting the positive impacts that AI and other automations could present to better deliver a public service. But this just shows how what is in the mind of certain policymakers over here. Another concern, as I mentioned, was regarding data protection, but now our data protection law was recently approved, but we still don't know how it will be put in practice. Our data protection authority was also very recently formed. They still are still not working formally. We still don't have all like the guidelines. So it's still all very in the beginning, but at least it's this infrastructure is beginning to get a bit more to exist, and then so they can be building upon it. And another part which is important is the lack of knowledge. We see that like there's a really asymmetry a situation of an asymmetry of information between like policymakers, society as a whole, regarding also the positive impacts that AI may have in society. So that's important to bear in mind, because we have, as civil society of research institutes and university, as I will mention in the end, this makes us think what would be our role to help move forward this AI governance debate, because if they don't know how, if really that kind of knowledge can result in eventually regulations that would prevent and will create great obstacles for the development of innovation and other eventually and the AI applications. So let's see. Next one, please. Okay, so from now till now, our policy responses would be is that we have a national AI strategy that is still being drafted. It was put under public consultation for a few months last year, and it covers areas such as specific areas such as public security, public areas like industries, research, development, and innovations, workforce and training. So these were like the main, and there's also a big topic regarding ethics and AI governance that was put to be discussed by civil society, private sector, and many people, and it indeed received many contributions, but we're still waiting to hear back from the government on how this AI national strategy will actually be developed. Another one was the data protection law that I mentioned. But again, there's already around 20 bill of laws that are trying to regulate AI, and they really differ from each other. But one, you can see that most of them try to have already a mixed misconception of AI and try to define it in such a way that that could actually present an obstacle for innovation. Actually, the ITS is doing this research of a paper on mapping all of the existing regulations that may have an impact in AI in such a way so that we can see how the status quo of our current regulation framework will be affected, has an implication on AI. Just moving 2 slides back, please. I will. So this is some of like activities that ITS is engaged on, trying to provide these capacity buildings to policymakers, judges, civil society as a whole. We are also engaged in fostering multi-stakeholder meetings to make all these sectors talk and get to know what are the main issues and implications regarding AI regulations. As I mentioned, this report we're making regarding the state of the art of regulations in Brazil that may have an impact in the AI in the AI development. And one point, very important point, is the inclusion aspect in this debate. So ITS, together with Berkman Klein Center and the network of research and society centers, organized this symposium, Artificial Intelligence and Inclusion, in 2018, or now 2017, just don't remember. But you can look it up, and it was the first event that was framed with this in this way, how we could make inclusion of important lens for all these discussions. And in the website, you'll see there were some, like the research questions and some of the developments that were brought by all these international scholars and practitioners that we were able to convene in Rio once when that was possible and have people traveling all around. So I think that's a nice resource to consult. And another point that I would like to enforce regarding Brazil specifically is interesting to see how the judicial system is getting the lead in the development of AI. This was a report that ITS did together with Columbia University for students from CIPA, which was the future of AI in the Brazilian judicial system. This research was really interesting as we did a mapping together with the judicial branch in Brazil, and we suggested how they could make the mapping of all the current AI applications that were being used differently by each state, and also a suggestion of how they should move forward with this governance system regarding the use of AI in the judiciary. And the judiciary has shown to be mostly in the forefront of this debate in a more organized way. They already have also resolution regarding the use of AI in the judiciary with issues regarding ethics, transparency. So it's interesting to follow how in Brazil, at least, the judiciary is positioning himself as like one of the powers in regarding the uses of AI in the public sector. And just to get in the end of this conversation, as I think most of us here have an affiliation or a participation within universities, I think it's nice to remember how universities may have an important role on all these discussions that we were mentioning, because they have like these open resources for AI research. It can develop all these studies, helping to see regarding impact analysis mechanism regarding social and economic impact of AI. They are well positioned to convene meetings with researchers and stakeholders, and most importantly, I think, is to try and translate AI mechanism and describe its application as a public as a whole, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions. So it's important that everyone that's engaged in some way on this matter, to try and come together with a way and to communicate better for society as a whole. And I think just moving towards the end.
Okay, yeah, just finalize. We have
No, I'm fine. That's fine. It just sorry for taking a bit longer, but I think that we can end it there.
No, you can have a few. Okay, yeah. So you're almost finished.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. We can take up some of the issues you later in the Q&A session. Thank you for fascinating and showing us the gap between the discussions in the developed or Western world or Northern hemisphere world, and that some of the key issues in the South, and basically showing us also the lack of basic infrastructure, many of the technologies that are hyped as AI to actually function in I think a large set of the global South. I'm originally also from Ethiopia, and I can speak of also of similar, even if not worse, problems in Africa. And actually, what was interesting is also that despite the fact that there are not many technologies being deployed, or despite the fact that of the lack of technology, it also shows that sometimes initiatives, how developing countries can take actually drastic measures. So you mentioned this prohibition of automation in the public sector without much deliberation, and I think that is also another thing that needs to be considered. Here, I think in a lot in the West End, there is a hesitation of it might be too early to intervene, at least to take that kind of drastic actions, while on the other side, it might be sometimes the case that there are drastic actions while things are quite at an early stage. So I hope that there will be many more questions in relation to your talk, and I think we now proceed to our third speaker and last speaker, Adam Nagy from Berkeley Client Center, Harvard. Adam, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you CPDP and BI Norwegian Business School for inviting me, and thanks to my co-panelists. I've already learned so much, and I'm excited to dig into it after my presentation. As Samson mentioned, I was a co-author of this paper that came out in January 2019. We call it the Principled AI Project for short. And the goal of this project was to develop a landscape of AI principles, to identify emerging trends, areas of consensus, bifurcations, and basically to help policymakers and people involved in this space to avoid duplicating their efforts and to facilitate collaboration and awareness of what already exists. I guess as an important caveat, the aim was never to be comprehensive or to make normative claims. It really was a survey of the landscape as we saw it, with all of our kind of subjective perspectives included. So with that caveat, I will dive in. So next slide, please. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this is essentially just a timeline of all the documents that we included in our data set. And there are other projects that I should mention that have done similar work. Algorithm Watch, which is based in Germany, has compiled a data set of AI governance documents. A team at ETH Zurich has similarly worked in this. So we're certainly not the only ones, although I think our criteria are slightly more selective. So I should explain how we came to include these 40 or 36 documents. So it was time-boxed. We began in 2016 and ended just before publication, so 2019. There's obviously been some since. But what we were interested in were documents that address principles or ethics. So essentially, were these normative and general declarations about how AI ought to be deployed, developed, and regulated. So as a result of this definition, we didn't really look at documents that were more like national strategies with very particular policy recommendations. We wanted to look more big picture. And similarly, while we did examine and include some documents that were sector specific, such as AI in the workforce or criminal justice, we excluded documents that were purely on one type of technology, such as facial recognition. So right off the bat, one thing that we noticed was that many of these documents borrowed heavily from international human rights. And I guess one thing I do also want to flag, just as questions to think about, is when considering this, are these ethical codes pushing us towards soft norms versus enforceable rights? What does it really mean to invoke human rights in these ethical codes? And one thing that we were very cognizant of was whether or not things were framed as rights or if they were not framed as rights. So if we can just zoom in on this a little bit closer. Again, I'm not quite sure how good the picture quality is, but essentially what we have is a wheel visualization where a color-coded wheel where green represents government, yellow is civil society, pink is the private sector, and blue, sorry, one second. Blue is multi-stakeholder groups, and the orange is intergovernmental organizations. And these were all the stakeholder groups or types of groups that we collected documents from. And then what we did was after we created this corpus, we basically read through all of them. We had something like 6 different languages on our team. So we were reading things in their original form as well as in translation. And after having read all of them, we created these 8 themes. And then within those themes, we had 47 principles that we identified. And what this visualization does, and I encourage everyone to check it out, is for each document, which represents a spoke on the wheel, we include a dot if they have any principles within one of those 8 themes. And then the size of the dot represents the number of those principles that are included. And we thought that this was a really interesting way to kind of identify trends and gaps visually. And also, we thought that it was also a neat way to represent how international human rights are treated in each of these documents. So the stars, there are 5 stars. Those represent documents that explicitly adopted an international human rights framework in their in how they treat AI. Whereas just the diamond means that they referred to international human rights, but they did not adopt it as a framework. All right, so next slide. So here are the 8 themes. We have accountability, transparency, and explainability, fairness and non-discrimination, professional responsibility, safety and security, privacy, human control of technology, promotion of human values. I'm not going to go into all 8 of these themes today. However, I do sort of want to dive into, if we have time, at least 1, maybe 2 of them.
Yeah, you can use 2-3 minutes, Adam.
Okay, great. So in that case, I will just go into accountability then. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, thank you. So accountability is actually divided into these 9 principles. And we notice this trend, if you go to the next slide, that 53% of all documents called for impact assessment, and then roughly half for some kind of evaluation and auditing, and roughly half for new regulations concerning AI. So, and this was a trend that we noticed internationally, and it was not restricted to one part of the world. And I think that's something that was a surprising finding for us, which was that while approaches differed, and our colleague mentioned this before, that the devil is in the details, and that the map is not necessarily the territory, there was quite a lot of overlap, and it's worth mentioning that things like GDPR and language that one would find in GDPR would pop up in documents all across the world, and were even adopted in certain industry documents. So I really, really do encourage folks to roll their sleeves up and and read our report and do this kind of analysis, because you will be very surprised to see how often certain language is borrowed and recycled kind of in this ecosystem. And while there are significant differences in how they will be implemented, oftentimes at the high level, we're dealing with very similar principles. I guess I'd like to just skip ahead through the privacy section, and in my remaining time, just talk about some of the questions that this work raises. So I guess, there's a lot of skepticism about the value of these kind of frameworks. I think that it's important to question them. Do these ethical frameworks actually consider, how people and institutions behave? Who were they made by? Why? Why now? What is the social, political, economic, and cultural context of the document creation? Is there any guidance about what happens when there's a conflict between principles which is something we noticed was really missing in this corpus. And what is the rationale for a principle over a regulation, and who benefits from that? So I'll leave you with those provocations, and I'm, like I said, eager to continue the conversation and answer some questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam, for very interesting discussions and overview of the paper and of the key concerns or the key drivers of AI governance, including the ethical principles across different jurisdictions and policy initiatives. I think we are now at the question and answer session, and I've received one question from an audience, I think two, and I have also my own questions. So I think I will just start with the audience question. One question coming from Edward, asking about the role of civil societies in ensuring that AI is developed in compliance with human rights. What do you think is the role that civil society should play, and what concrete steps need to be taken for civil societies to have impactful role in the development of AI in compliance with human rights? Perhaps you can, Selina, you can start with the human rights. What do you think the role of civil societies in ensuring that AI is developed in light of human rights?
So I think this will depend, may vary from country to country, but speaking from Brazil, I would say that civil society, and then putting, I think, talking from like ITS, I think we actually civil society has a great role because especially when it's related to researching activities, because civil society has at least like one of the roles that it can play is actually trying to show the possible complications and the possible situations that AI applications may have regarding and in possible violations of human rights. So this can be an important raising awareness attitude here. But again, in the other way, showing how also benefits can be achieved by the use of responsible AI applications. So I think civil society is in the midway as bridging this conversation with companies and private sector and the government, so that we find a nice balance. And actually governance, I think, is in the key of this discussion, especially before any regulation takes place.
Thank you, Selina. Angela, do you have anything to add on the role of civil societies, especially also from an Asian perspective?
Yeah, sure. Just to say that, especially in the Asia Pacific, it's such a vast region, and countries are so different to each other, and the role of civil society and how it acts in different countries in the Asia Pacific region is also really different. So I think it's something that's hard to answer in a very general or regional level. I think the kind of priorities of civil society differ as well, really to some extent, depending on whether the country is a kind of developed economy or it's an emerging economy, because development priorities are really key, particularly in the rollout of AI in China. And I think civil society broadly supports AI rollout in China. It makes a whole lot of things easier, or it can make things easier in day-to-day life. Automated court system, for instance, and automation of the bureaucracy is viewed, I think, by a lot of people as a good thing. Whereas somewhere like Australia, you hear similar kinds of concerns as in Europe or North America around privacy and ensuring procedural fairness when the government or courts are using AI. So and privacy also being a kind of being more prominent. But in countries like India, there's a bit of a mixture of everything actually in terms of civil society concerns, because also privacy has been a really important issue there with things like Aadhaar, the government biometric system. So it's really complicated. I think civil society will play a different role in different countries. And I think given that CPDP is quite I think it's fair to say Eurocentric conference, although this is not a Eurocentric panel, the kind of role civil society plays in AI governance and ethics discussions in Europe is not going to transfer to other parts of the world. Maybe some other countries like Australia, yes, but there may be kind of very different ways in which civil society mobilizes and what civil society's concerns are in different parts of the world.
Thank you, Angela. Adam, perhaps have you seen a bit? Can you tell us a bit the role of civil society that you've seen in the documents that you have studied from in your paper? Perhaps you could also elaborate a bit on the role of civil society in the US discourse in relation to AI governance.
Yeah, certainly. Just to stay in step with my co-panelists, I'll talk about civil society in the US. And I think under the Trump administration, AI governance they sort of adopted a checklist approach where really it's more about preempting regulation more than anything else. And with the new administration, it will be critical for civil society to be part of the conversation and to assist the various federal agencies in figuring out these important questions around fairness and unequal impacts of AI as they are applicable to the sort of responsibility of the different agencies. One example that I can kind of immediately think of was our Housing and Urban Development Authority, HUD, last year passed a regulation that, among other things, basically created a loophole where you could, if you use an algorithm to make decisions that impacted housing, you were essentially exempt from disparate impact scrutiny, which is already an extremely weakened kind of legal theory in the US as it stands. And so that's something where we need folks who understand housing and work in that space to join forces with people who think about AI and the societal impacts of AI, and sort of that kind of synergy between people who might not otherwise be working together will be critical, especially with the amount of things that the Biden administration will have pulling at its attention right now.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for the input. I have also a few questions of my own. So I want to go back a bit to the core of the panel, or to the title of the panel, this global AI governance or artificial intelligence governance. And Angela, for example, in your report on AI governance and ethics, the global perspective, you mentioned quite several global initiatives. And of course, at least there seems to be also some consensus, at least among some scholars, that a global approach, a global standard or norms could be desirable. But we've seen from Melina's input that the gap is quite significant between, for example, what we talk about in the Western or Northern Hemisphere and some part of the developing world. So my question would be, why are we then talking about global norms if we don't have the groundwork similar? can we talk about shared concerns of European citizens or European agencies, and then similar others concerns also similar in other parts of the world, such as Brazil or other parts? So why are we talking about global norms and standards?
I think there's a kind of quite a fundamental reason why, because the technology is global, or at least for now, it's a global technology, because there's concern that, you know, maybe China is going to go down its own path, and the rest of the world, particularly led by Western countries, are going to go down another path as well. And I think this has been very prominent in the context of the trade war between the US and China, who are the two biggest developers of AI as well. I'm not sure now, with the kind of rearranging of geopolitics that COVID and also the new US administration have brought, how likely it is there's going to be this split. But nevertheless, I think for now we do have this global technology. It's being rolled out in different parts of the world, in some ways regardless of what the kind of local circumstances are. And I think there's also understanding or a realization now that we don't necessarily want something like what happened with the internet, where it was kind of rolled out with quite minimal governance and norm setting. Maybe that's not desirable for AI. So I think that's why there is this conversation about trying to establish global norms. I would have said last year that I don't think it's very likely that we're going to get very strong global norms on AI, because there's too much politics, particularly between the US and China. This year, maybe not. But I think, unfortunately, what the big powers are doing around AI and AI governance is still going to set the tone really for whether there will be global norms or not. I think the development of GPI, so the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence that I mentioned, to which a lot of Western and developed countries, including in Asia, are members of, but notably not China. I mean, that is an attempt to foster some kinds of global norms, but the people or the countries involved are not a kind of true or full representation of important, at least national players on AI. So I'm not really convinced we're going to get much in the way of truly global norms, but that is an interesting initiative which may well produce something for those countries which are involved in it.
Thank you, Azara. Selina or Adam, do you have anything? Do you want to add anything to the discussion on the importance?
Well, really, if I could quickly jump here in the discussion. Of the questions that Adam put in the end of his talk, why principles and not norms? Well, I think here we can make this parallel with the human rights, international human rights treaties and applications, that it all started with like a universal declaration, really just because it wasn't a binding document, it was like soft law. And then it evolved to 2 different treaties, because again, some part like United States wouldn't be willing to sign other the economic social covenant. So I think it's really hard to get, I think, now a global a global document that will have like a common like denominator for all regions, but it will, I think, take a bit more time. But anyway, one way to move the discussion forward would be to from the start include countries from all regions, and especially developing countries, because they may be one of the most affected by the consequences of AI and normally are not engaged in these high-level discussions. So one way to have a global document would be to be as inclusive as possible in this policy discussion.
I have a few questions, but I think I want to raise one question posed by a participant named Sonia. So, what do you think is the impact of the pandemic over AI governance? Perhaps we can start with the US as one of the hard-hit countries by the pandemic. How is it affecting? Has it intensified the need to deploy as much as also the need for some governance framework?
Oh gosh, that's a bit of a curveball question. I don't think that I feel as though the pandemic combined with the election and just the political situation in the US, it sucked so much oxygen out of the room in terms of making progress on these questions, particularly internationally. And I do feel like it's something that was not a priority in the waning days of the last administration. So to the extent that the pandemic had an effect, I think it probably had a kind of de-acceleration in terms of making progress on the regulatory front. While I do agree, Samson, with your comment that we have seen the acceleration of new applications of AI in fighting the pandemic, but I don't think that there's been anything so groundbreaking in that space that it's changed the conversation very much. In the US, frankly, we have a very difficult time doing any kind of public interest technology, and when it comes to fighting the pandemic, anyone who's familiar with how proximity tracing has been rolled out in the US would probably co-sign that. So.
Great, thank you. I'll just one last question before I think we close. I think Angela and Selina can comment on this question. In the white paper from the European Commission on Artificial Intelligence, the Commission emphasizes the role of AI based on European values and even calls for the export of its values across the world. So my question is, if possibly we will have some kind of global norms or at some point, is exporting values from the EU to other world, is that the path forward? Would those values work, for example, when implemented in other countries? And Selina, you can comment on this by linking with the education in Brazil and Latin America. How would an AI developed based on European technology and based on European values would work in your context?
If I can start on this, I could say yes and no to whether European values should be exported on AI. I'd say yes, because particularly around data protection, EU obviously has quite high standards. And when looking in from various countries, including Australia, I think to some extent Singapore as well, actually having stronger data protection standards like we have in Europe would be great. And that also feeds into AI governance. So in the alternative reality where COVID isn't such a problem in places like Australia and New Zealand, there has actually been law reform in New Zealand in the last year to bring New Zealand's Privacy Act more in line with GDPR standards. And there's a consultation on Australia's privacy legislation at the moment for this the same purpose. I have spent a lot of time criticising Australia's data protection legislation as being quite weak. So in that sense, yes, having some European values on data protection would be a good thing. The answer, no, why it wouldn't be such a good thing, is when we're looking at the fact that particularly in the Asia Pacific, there are so many different cultures and different approaches, even to kind of norms like privacy and data protection or other forms of AI governance. And that's why I mentioned the indigenous perspectives on AI governance, which seem to be a bit more acknowledged more in New Zealand, certainly compared to Australia. New Zealand's much more progressive for a lot of things compared to Australia. But I think that really represents a very different approach, where exporting European norms didn't work very well, 300 years ago when New Zealand was colonized. Exporting them for the purposes of AI governance also won't work very well in a different context, where there are indigenous worldviews and laws which still apply there. And and I think there is a kind of aspect of Europe wanting to export its own norms that actually is quite inappropriate, even if those norms in practice sometimes are quite good. But I'm quite concerned.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think let's give Selina to reflect of 2 minutes, and then we have to stop the panel. So thank you, Angela, for your reflection. Angela, Selina, you can have 2 minutes to reflect on European values.
Okay, very
on European values. Yeah.
Just building up on what Angela was saying, I think, well, privacy, data protection law, the GDPR was actually a model framework for people all around the globe, as deemed to have high standards. But actually, regarding like an AI model of governance, I would say we have to make take a step backwards to see how the inclusion aspect and what are the measures that should be taken to prevent biases and discriminatory impacts of all these AI applications may have on people here on the global south. As we know, there is a fact that we have racial discrimination, because depending on how the algorithms will be defined, all that the discussions, we know that if all these applications will be drafted by white male, the results will not be as inclusive as it should. So I think the discussion has to be including all these, taking into consideration all these points before we start to discuss and all this AI governance structure.
Okay, thank you everyone for a great discussion. I have had a few more questions, and we had also two questions from the panel, but our time is up. I have learned and enjoyed the discussions. I hope our followers also did learn something. And I want to thank our panelists, Angela, Selina, and Adam, for your great input. Thank you for enlightening us with your perspectives. I hope this would contribute to at least understanding the shared concerns, but also the differences that we have to accommodate in order to move forward. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of CPDP. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.